Eddie is a distinguished professor and chair of neurosurgery at UC San Francisco. His clinical expertise includes the neurosurgical treatment of epilepsy, brain tumors, and pain. And he published a paper a few weeks ago, interestingly, in Nature Neuroscience on pain, if you're interested in that aspect of his research. But today I think he will talk to us on what he's more broadly known for is his research in speech. So his lab's research in speech related to elucidating the neuronal mechanisms of speech production and speech reception, as well as leading the charge in developing a practical speech neuroprosthetic for the disabled. So among his numerous accolades, he's the 2015 Blavatnik Laureate in Life Sciences, and he's also a member of the National Academy of Medicine. So the theme of this meeting is balancing innovation and translation. So I think that aptly sums up Eddie's body of work, and it's my pleasure to introduce Eddie Chang.
Thanks, Dean. It's great to be here. This is actually my first time to the BCI Society meeting, and it's amazing, and I wish I'd been going for quite some time. Primarily because of the people. It's been incredible to engage with folks that I've long admired and have definitely influenced our work. And so this lecture is going to focus a little bit about the trajectory that we've taken over the last decade to develop what we call a speech neuroprosthesis. And what that refers to is a device that we're hoping, and many other of our colleagues are hoping, that can restore communication for people who are paralyzed. The image that you see on the left is one that we worked on with our illustrator. And the basic idea is that we want to tap into neural signals to essentially read out the thoughts and intended communication of someone who's lost the ability to communicate. And our general strategy for doing that is to build machines that can recognize the intent, recognize the basic processes, physiological processes, in particular that of the vocal tract, in order to reconstruct speech. And I will describe that process and how far it's taken us from text to words, and then you'll see beyond. So here are my disclosures. So I think that anything that you got to start with, you have to really recognize this early work from Phil Kennedy, who's here. I saw him earlier yesterday. This is really probably the true first BCI attempt for speech, what they call speech BCI. And in this particular setup, what he had was someone who was locked in, and 3 microelectrodes that were connected to a computer. These are 3 microelectrodes, and then undergoing some signal processing, a decoder, and through a speech synthesizer. And I think this was very important. I remember I was in residency at the end of my neurosurgery training and reading this article, and thinking this is really incredible.
Speak. Listen. Speak.
So what Phil and his colleagues were able to do was to do the first real-time synthesis of vowels, and to have the subject, essentially like a cursor control, move the form in space, have an audio, and that was fed back to the patient. Actually, the patient learned, got significantly better during the course of this training. I think that this is really important pioneering work. And at the same time, I also recognized that if we wanted to get to full speech, that we needed to understand the physiology of speech much, much better in order to get all the consonants, vowels, syllables, and so on. And so the work in my lab has actually had 2 parallel processes. One is the exercise of decoding, BCI-related decoding, which I'll talk about, but also more fundamentally about the basic science and the physiology of the vocal tract and how it gives rise to things like vowels, consonants, and syllables. And the starting point for a lot of our work was based in this idea that there's this body map called the homunculus, and there's aspects of this that are clearly outdated, but there are aspects of it that are very relevant, especially in the neurosurgical realm. One of the first things that we wanted to do was to use physiology directly from the human brain as people were speaking. And what was quite interesting is, just as recent as 13 years ago, we didn't really have direct physiology from that part of the brain while people were speaking normally. We had a lot of non-invasive imaging, beautiful work there, but real-time local physiology on the order of milliseconds and millimeters was really lacking, and that's what we try to do in the early days here. So our approach was using electrocorticography, and that refers to multi-contact electrode grids that are placed subdurally on the brain surface. I'm an epilepsy surgeon, I specialize in this, and one of the first things that we did was develop a high-density electrode grid. So this is 256 channels, part of which samples from the speech motor cortex. And another really fundamental thing that happened is we were starting this kind of research when I was doing my postdoc with Bob Knight, was that Nathan Crone discovered the high gamma signal, which turned out to be a really important signal in the ECOG that wasn't appreciated before, and we've leveraged that in order to get a lot of and extract as much spatial temporal information as possible. Now, this video is going to show you the activity from the speech motor cortex, the part that controls the lateral part of the motor cortex, controls the mouth, lips, jaw, when someone speaks a given sentence. And I want you to appreciate how rapidly and how precise the activations are in that part of the brain when we speak.
Shipbuilding is a most fascinating process.
So for the last decade, what we've been doing is dissecting the function of each one of those spots on the speech motor cortex. Our goal is to understand how it represents speech movements and how they're all different. You can tell that they're not all occurring at the same time, but a very precise spatial temporal code. So our work generally has been to decode or to understand that neuroelectric code. And so the first paper we really did on this was a very simple one, where patients in the epilepsy monitoring unit were implanted with these electrodes, and they spoke just 60 syllables. You can see here the patterns associated with the syllables ba, da, and ga. And one of the things that we immediately recognize is not as simple as one electrode is encoding one given syllable or consonant, but in fact there's a distributed code. But it's not the same for each particular electrode. Some are active, some are not active, and they're different across each set of syllables. One of the results of this, when you looked over a couple of subjects, was a new kind of functional map of the semiotopic organization, and this is something that was derived from real-time physiology. We just didn't have that at the time. So it was a very simple study, but something that was foundational for us in terms of understanding the map layout. And this is a coarse estimate of what we call the mesoscale. So these are the general coordinates for the positions, the functional representations of the larynx, the lips, the tongue, and also a secondary representation of the larynx. Now, that was not so clear at the time about where the larynx was located, and we did some follow-up studies. One of my graduate students, Ben Dichter, in fact, did his whole PhD to discover a part of the middle part of the precentral gyrus that we call the dorsal laryngeal motor cortex that is really important for control of the larynx. So the increased activity in the dorsal motor cortex actually drives the tension of the vocal folds. And that was really not something that was described in the homunculus in any particular way. What Ben showed was that this is an important area for encoding speech, but also when people are singing melodies. So it's something very fundamental about the motor control of pitch. I also want to highlight that at that time, it was a really exciting time because our understanding of the laryngeal motor cortex was just evolving. Christina, who I saw here earlier yesterday, a pioneer neurologist who did some of the defining neuroimaging. And in this particular review that she wrote, basically the idea is that the laryngeal motor cortex in human is very different than we think it's expressed in monkeys. And in this review, she actually articulates and was the first to really speculate that the laryngeal motor cortex in humans is not only important for human vocal control, but it's not that important in monkeys, number one. And number two is that its putative role may be one of the reasons why humans have this very, very specialized and unique ability to speak. So there's a lot of evolutionary significance to speech. It's a unique and defining aspect of our behavior, and it may be tied to some of the physiology that we've discussed. And this has now been picked up on in more general theories on the evolution of speech and even language. In recent years, we've actually discovered that these areas that we call the dorsal laryngeal motor cortex actually have multiple functions. There's auditory functions there. If you stimulate there with electrical stimulations, patients will vocalize involuntarily. Some work that we have in progress right now demonstrates that motor sequencing is highly involved in this middle precentral gyrus. We think it's the actual Broca's area. Traditionally, we thought of Broca's area, the inferior frontal gyrus, over here as the traditional language center of production in the brain. Many studies, including ours and others, have really invalidated that idea that it's important for speech articulation. And there's really a lot of converging evidence that the precentral gyrus is not just a motor cortex, but a premotor area that's important for articulatory planning, sequencing, and execution of speech. The last thing is that when people have injuries of this particular part of the brain, they can lose the ability to speak fluently. I'll give you an example of that. This is a patient that we saw who had a surgery in the back part of the middle frontal gyrus, not a traditional language area, not Broca's or Wernicke's area. But he has a very, very selective deficit we call apraxia of speech. And this is where he has a disorder of the articulatory coordination and planning in speech production, but he doesn't have any muscle weakness. He's got full strength in his mouth, his vocal tract, and he actually has normal language. He's an accountant and functions in that, but he can't speak. In this video, you're going to see him trying to repeat microscopic. We've asked him to just say the word microscopic.
Microscopic, microscopic,
Okay, so the basic idea is Broca's area is still working there. Wernicke's area is still working, but he's got a selective deficit in this thing that we call speech articulation. So I've showed you evidence that you can record the physiology from this area and it correlates to what people are speaking, but also injuries to this particular area actually have very devastating consequences for the fluent articulation of speech. Now, what about the non-laryngeal movements, the things that have to do with the movements of the lips, jaw, and larynx? We've done studies on that. And one of the reasons why speech has been understudied is because the movements that we use to control the vocal tract are not as simple as the two-dimensional skeletal muscles that we have in our limb. For example, your lips actually are sphincter. The muscle there is round, and when it tightens, it closes and opens the lips. The tongue has very complex kind of dynamics, something similar to a hydrostat. You push down on the back, the front of the tongue moves forward. It's got more than 24 different muscles that shape the contour of the tongue. It's that shape of the tongue that actually gives rise to all of the different vowels. These are, again, very different than the muscles that we have in the limbs. But that doesn't mean they're not studyable. In fact, we've been able to use non-invasive imaging, imaging of the mouth, using ultrasound of the tongue and mouth in order to image what's going on there. We can also use modeling to extract what's going on there. And in this study, what we did was we looked at individual electrodes in the speech motor cortex, and we found essentially what kind of movements they were coded to. And each individual millimeter area in that part of the brain codes a different set of movements. And this particular electrode, for example, the movements, time is expressed as a function of line thickness. So the movement that's being described by activity in that electrode is the tongue tip moves up and the tongue back goes down. The lower incisor, this LI, is up and down. So this is what we would call a speech primitive. And all that means is that it's a coordinated movement. It's not just one single articulator, not one muscle, but in fact the coordinated movement of multiple muscles in the vocal tract to give this tongue forward, back, down, opening, closure of the lower jaw. Okay, so it's that movement that is really important for some sounds like the word dad, the duh and dad. And we found that all of these trajectories, if you looked over all these different dozens of electrodes, most of the movements you can find in the human vocal tract are out and back. They're actually like reaches. For those of you who study limb motor control or arm motor control, it's actually very similar. There's out and back trajectories that are very stereotyped. And this is very important because the dimensionality of the vocal tract is nearly infinite. There's so many muscles that have very large degrees of freedom. But when you look at the actual movements that are created by speech, it's much, much lower dimensional, constrained by these set of speech primitives. So just to give you an example, if you look at one particular electrode here, this animation basically shows the kind of movement that's encoded by it. If you look at the lips, when someone's saying the word proof, it's that rounding of the and movement and opening of the lips that is really important for that. But it's also coordinated with some other movements in the vocal tract. If you compare that with a different electrode, that it is really important for encoding the sound the. It's what we call a dental fricative, the th and that. The front of the tongue moves to the back of the teeth, and that's the critical movement for that. So every little spot in that part of the lateral part of the motor cortex encoding different movements, coordinate movements. By themselves, they have no meaning. These movements are just movements. But when you put them all together with respiration and the other movements, they give rise to speech. They give rise to words. And this is part of the code that we've been working on. So just to give you an example of that, in this particular study, what we looked at was the encoding across hundreds of different electrodes. Each column here corresponds to one given electrode, and each row in this top cluster corresponds to different articulators in the vocal tract. So that's a larynx, the tongue, top of the tongue, the blade, the tongue tip, the lower jaw, the incisor, upper and lower lips. And what you see here is that there's actually a patterning across these different electrodes. You can do some clustering to see the general category of these clusters. The other thing that you can do is also map the phonetic selectivity, the selectivity to 40 different phonemes in English across these different electrodes. And one of the main points of this figure is primarily to just show you that about 8 years ago, we had achieved essentially this idea that we could map out all of the different consonants and vowels of English. Like there was a fairly comprehensive, what we'd call a dictionary for all of the different sounds in English. And this was just by recording people talking normally for about half an hour. There's some really important work that came out at the same time. This is work from Mark Seletsky's group. Emily Muckler, who was a student with Mark, produced something that was very, very overlapping and actually came out at the same time. So this has all been working in evolution in parallel. So once we had those findings, we started to think seriously about the decoding. You know, what I had just described is what we call encoding. It's like, how do we explain the neural activity at single electrodes? And what are the movements in the vocal tract that explain the activity at single electrodes, and how do they look like in that map? Now, we created a different set of projects we call decoding. So you take a population of neural activity along with some other computational tools to try to reconstruct or synthesize or interpret all of that aggregate brain activity for the purpose of decoding the intention of someone to speak. And so there are several kind of conditions that are, this is very relevant, including ALS. Stephen Hawking had a very particular form of ALS where he lost the ability to speak. but brainstem stroke, certain kinds of cerebral palsy. So this is a huge unmet need. Many of you know that, of course, at this BCI meeting, many of you are working directly on this problem as well. So at the time when we were sort of making progress in these encoding models, this article came on MIT Tech Review reviewing some of the progress from our group and others. This is in 2014, and the basic question here is, could a person who is paralyzed and unable to speak, like the physicist Stephen Hawking, use a brain implant to carry on a conversation? Okay, so that's essentially what we're trying to do. We're trying to restore the ability to communicate for someone who's lost that ability based on these physiological findings that we have from speech motor cortex. So we wrote a review on this actually not long ago that was published in JAMA, where we talk about the uniqueness of speech and why it is an important modality for communication. There's many different ways you can achieve that by handwriting, texting, typing. These are just normal ways, healthy people using different forms, either limbs, hand, etc. And BCIs that have been parallels to these, like using cursor control, even handwriting, have made huge, huge progress. Frank Willett and Krishna and Jimmy Henderson made huge improvements in things like handwriting, getting that rate up. But even with that, speech is in a different category by itself. The way I'm speaking right now is probably about 120 words per minute. The average conversational speech is about 150. We get up to about 200. The world record is 600 words per minute. Okay. So it's a really important modality because it allows the ideas from my brain to transfer to yours. And that's really the basis of human civilization, this idea that I can transfer the ideas from my mind to yours, and I can do it quickly. And the corollary of that is when that it's lost, it's extremely isolating and disabling. Early on in this process of decoding, we had done some work ourselves on this, but I think that there was a breakthrough that in multiple ways I think was really important. This work from Christian, who's here, I think is very important because I think it was a sign of the times that we were making great progress in speech recognition technology. Siri, think Siri, Alexa, etc. Rapid progress in machine learning. And a lot of those tools actually turn out to be relevant for the task of decoding brain activity. So in the speech technology and engineering world, the task is to change from an audio signal into text. In this particular paper, it's about brain signals into text. And at the time, this is really the state of the art in terms of using some of those tricks and tools that are very important in speech engineering, and we've been doing some similar things. In fact, we used one of the models after that, using a form of what we call machine translation. So this is using LSTM, but an encoding decoder framework that is very similar and inspired by the algorithms that were used by Google and other companies to do machine translation. So, if you translate, for example, English to French, about 5 years ago, these algorithms were using something called an LSTM, using an encoder-decoder framework. And that's something that we use, but not translating English to French, but brain activity to text in English. And it turned out that worked very well. So using this approach that Joe Macon adapted, an encoder-decoder framework, decoding speech from people who were speaking normally in the epilepsy unit, we could get very, very low word error rates of less than 5%, compared to many other standard speech recognition, other comparisons. So this was in people in our epilepsy monitoring unit. I'll give you another example. Gopala, who's a postdoc, and Josh Chartier, who's a graduate student, did a project to synthesize speech, not text from the brain, but actually translate the brain activity into sounds that you can hear. And one of the insights and approaches in this particular paper is they take the brain activity and then they translate it into a model in a computer of the movements. Remember, earlier on my talk, I've described how we spent so much time trying to understand the movements of the vocal tract. We think that that's a really important approach to this. Because if you can translate it to the movements, then you don't need that much more information because there's a lot of data that we already have about how those movements relate to audible speech. So the machine learning doesn't have to learn everything from brain activity to the sounds. It just needs to understand how it relates to movements of the vocal tract. And what they show basically, it requires much, much less data if you take what we call a biomimetic approach. If you model it the way that we actually produce speech sounds through the vocal tract. So I'll give you a couple examples of the output from this. These are two spectrograms. This is the original speech that someone spoke. Again, this is not someone who's paralyzed. This is someone who's in our epilepsy monitoring unit with a 256 channel array and just speaking normally. And this is what was decoded by the computer using their algorithm. You can see that it's got a lot of the gross, sort of features that are similar across the two, but it's actually still pretty degraded. But what was exciting to us and our colleagues at the time was that this was really at the threshold level of intelligence. Some of the phrases, not all of them, started to become very intelligible, and I'll give you an example of that here. So in this video demo, you're going to see the brain activity when someone is speaking a given sentence. You'll see a simulation of that articulator model in the computer, and then you're going to hear what is generated by that computer decoder. And then you'll hear what the person originally said. Okay, so you first hear what the decoder produced in the speech synthesis, and then you'll hear what the person actually said with their mouth.
The proof that you are seeking is not available in books.
The proof that you are seeking is not available in books.
The proof that you are seeking is not available in books. Shipbuilding is the most fascinating process.
Shipbuilding is a most fascinating process.
Shipbuilding is the most fascinating process.
So again, really just at that boundary where things start to sound intelligible. And that was exciting. This was a couple of years following, I think, another really important milestone in the development of the BCIs. And this is the study from Mariska and also Nick Ramsey that was done out here. And I think this study is important because there were two things. One is that it was very practical. It was essentially taking some device technology that was a research tool. Two, it uses a form of technology called electrocorticography, where the strip electrodes were placed on the brain surface. And it allowed people to actually communicate using this interface. And people were able to do it at home. And on top of that, these were fairly severe forms of paralysis, including lockdown. So this is actually a very important study that moved the whole field forward and got me thinking that we need to take seriously how do we do this more chronically implanted. Now, we don't have that system that we want to make it fully wireless yet, but there were other great studies happening in the BCI realm from BrainGate, others using the Black Rock pedestal. And so what we did was we wanted to move into people who are paralyzed and can't speak. So we created this trial called the BRAVO trial, and this is in 2019. BRAVO stands for BCI Restoration of Arm and Voice. Okay, that's where we got BRAVO. And this has been very important for our translational efforts. The goal of this is a pathway to a clinical device that is safe, robust, high performance. Safe and robust, what I mean by that is using technology that we know to be safe, subdural grid electrodes that are on the surface of the brain that don't penetrate and don't cause injury to the brain. Something that you can imagine it would last for quite a long time. And we've seen through the Ramsey study, through Neuropace, with epilepsy electrode, many examples where subdural electrodes are safe and robust over time. The question is really about the performance. It's really about how much performance can you squeeze out of that approach, and how many channels, what's the bandwidth, et cetera. So this was a study that I did with my very close colleague, Karnish Ganguly. His lab really focused on the limb control part of it, and ours focused on the speech, and I'm really just talking about our part of it. But he's got a lot of great results related to limb decoding work. So what this involves is the implantation of a 128-channel electrode subdural grid. That was our first version, and in the latest, I'll show you the results of using 253, using a percutaneous port. So we took one of our epilepsy grids, and then we connected it to the BlackRock pedestal, and BlackRock has been really important collaborator for us to get this developed. And it's covering essentially the whole lateral part of the motor cortex, everything from the hand area down to the speech areas. It's a lot of real estate that is important for both of these functions. For people who have severe paralysis, impairing communication, and movement. Okay, so this required an IDE, and fortunately we were able to work very collaboratively and quickly with the FDA, in particular Heather Dean and Julia Slocum, to figure out how to do this safely and how to, try this out. And they've been important collaborators for us in this project. So the first patient we reported in this article in New England Journal, again, we were very inspired by what Nick's group had done, and we in fact submitted to the same journal. It's sort of an evolution of progress in this area. And one of the things that we did was we were very, very fortunate to encounter a young man who goes by Pancho. So 15 years ago, Pancho was in a car accident. He had a brainstem stroke. He woke up from that stroke in a coma and realized he couldn't talk or move his arms or legs. He was absolutely devastated. And at the time, he was only 20 years old. Okay, and prime of life, but totally devastated. And for the last 15 years, he's actually thrived. He's built a community of people that really care about him a lot, and he's actually quite a vibrant person. Turned out to be the perfect, absolute perfect collaborator and patient to work on this trial. So the way he communicates, because he's got a little bit of residual neck movements, the way that Pancho communicates is using a stick that's attached to his baseball cap. And he uses his Dynavox machine essentially to type out individual letters and words at about 3 to 5 words per minute. And this is the way he communicates. He sends us emails. He's quite eloquent despite learning English as a second language. And after he was paralyzed, he's been a really important collaborator for our progress. This is a picture of the MRI. And for those of you who don't recognize what this looks like, it's the sort of mid-plane of the brain. And this is the part of the brain stem. You can see that most of his brain stem is actually missing. That's because after 15 years, there's a lot of atrophy of that tissue from the stroke. So this is probably only a quarter of the volume that we would expect of the normal brain stem. Now, why is a brain stem so important? Well, the brain stem is what connects the cerebrum, the brain, to the nerves that go down to the spinal cord, and then also the nerves out to the face and vocal tract. So this is why Pancho became paralyzed. Critical part of his brainstem, this connection structure between his brain and the rest of the world, was disconnected. So what we did was we implanted an electrode just like the epilepsy patients that we had done for over 10 years, and we connected to the BlackRock pedestal, 128-channel array, and the signals from that array are then processed to a computer that analyzes the signal and decodes the brain activity into text that is displayed on a screen. So this is what that pedestal looks like. He's lived with that now for 4.5 years, still very healthy. We're going to continue to monitor how that does, and the signals continue to look good. Here's the head stage that translates these analog signals into digital signals, and then it goes through an HDMI cable to the computer. This is what the signals look like. Okay, so this is why the signal processing, this is why the machine learning is so important. The task at hand is to, again, translate brain signals into words. This is the brain's language and translated into a language that you and I can decode as words. So in this project, what we did was we focused on 50 words at first. And here are the results. So these were the 50 words that were targets that we asked Pancho to try and attempt to say. And these were the ones that were predicted. And if it was perfect, you would see a black line across this diagonal. But it's not perfect. There are some words that are confusable. And not surprisingly, the ones that have similar phonemes. For example, no and not, nurse, for example. Some of those things logically were confused because they're phonetically similar, and that's what we expected from this part of the brain, even though they have really different meaning. And what we found is that if you combine the word decoding on those 50-word vocabulary with the language model, which helps you understand the sequences of those words, we could get down to about 20% word error rate and about 15 words per minute. So this was a great start for us. In fact, this was the first successful demonstration of words and sentences that were decoded from someone who's paralyzed. We'd done a lot of work in people who were normally speaking. This is the first demonstration of someone who's fully paralyzed. And another important thing that I alluded to earlier, and why this was important to us, why we didn't take other approaches to doing this study and use the electrocorticography, is we wanted to leverage the stability. So this is the neural activity, the high gamma that Nathan Crone discovered 15, 20 years ago, that is still there after weeks and months and years. At this one particular electrode, while he's saying goodbye, we still see that it's robust and it's a fairly stable signal. So this is demo. Here's the HDMI connector to Pancho. Someone in the lab is writing him a question or prompt, and then his brain activity is going to be decoded into words in this lower part. The blinking dots means the algorithm has detected he's trying to say something. And then the second step of the algorithm is trying to figure out what word he's trying to say. So it's 2 steps. First is speech detection, and then the second one is word classification. And he's trying to do this one word at a time. This last example is going to be one where some of the words are incorrect. The algorithm actually keeps track of the word probability of all 50 words, not just the top word. You just see the top word displayed on the screen, but the algorithm keeps track of all 50 words and can use the context in the language model to autocorrect the sentence. So if it's not the first correct word, it will take the second, third, or fourth, and then up-rank it using the language model. So this is an example where some of the top-ranked words were actually wrong, but in the context of the sequence of the word probabilities, can autocorrect using language model to get to the right answer. Okay, so many of you are familiar with this. It's the same kind of autocorrect feature that you have with texting, etc. And then to get to a larger vocabulary, that was just 50 words, we tried a different thing. But instead of trying to output full words, this was a different strategy, actually trying to spell out words as quickly as possible, get to characters as quickly as possible using a spelling strategy. And we did this actually using a word approach. So instead of saying, A, B, C, etc., C, A, T to spell things out, we used target words that have more information. So in this case, we use NATO code words like alpha, beta, Charlie. And if you know the history on this, the NATO code words were devised to improve intelligibility, right? Instances where you cannot make errors, you do not want to mix those letters and numbers. So this turned out to be the perfect approach to this. And at 1,000-word vocabulary spelling, it was up to 90+ accuracy. So this is just to give you an example. It's slow, so I sped up the video here. But the point of this is to show, again, about the robustness and stability. This is what we call plug and play. So Margaret, who's on our team, is plugging in Pancho It's going to warm up, maybe the first sentences wrong, but then you'll see the rest get on track. But this is just the start of the recording session. Margaret's just shown up that morning to where Pancho lives, plugs him in to the BlackRock machine, and he's ready to go. No calibration. Occasionally, maybe every couple weeks, months, we can update the model. But this is a really nice feature of having stable recordings that don't require calibration, an important feature for the clinical robustness of this technology. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about now is the latest chapter. And so in September of last year, we enrolled another Bravo participant. And I think we were extremely lucky, again, to find someone who was very motivated. So motivated, she actually moved from Canada to participate in this trial in California. I was very reluctant at first, to be honest with you, because, well, various logistical reasons, but it turned out to be a terrific fit. So she goes by Anne, and she's agreed to share her story with this. So Anne had a stroke 18 years ago. Unfortunately, it was actually only 3 or 4 months after she gave birth to her first child. And absolutely devastating. Somewhat similar to Pancho's stroke, actually. And so I'm going to show you a little bit about her ability to communicate and how she's been limited by that. So our speech-language pathologist, Patricia, is asking her some questions as part of an assessment. And you'll see sort of the extent of injury she has.
Heard that you are not from here. Tell me about where you're living right now. You number 1 here? Yeah, give this one a try.
Okay, so this gives you an example of the problem, what's at stake. You can tell that she's very frustrated. The most she can get out is vocalization, pretty much 0% intelligibility. She does have some intact movements, like she can maybe open and close her jaw a little bit, but extreme weakness in all the vocal tract muscles. Actually very difficult for her to even vocalize extensively. So in this particular project, we actually explicitly asked her to not phonate, but try to speak without phonating, without producing any sound, and just do her best on this. So here's the MRI from Anne, and like I said, she had a stroke 18 years ago, similar area. This is the pons, part of the brainstem that connects the brain to the nerves in the spinal tract. And we work with the FDA to now use a 253 channel electrode array, because we saw what we could get with Pancho. We wanted to see if we can do better, basically, with more electrodes, a little bit denser. So with Pancho is about 4 millimeter spacing. This is now at 3 millimeter spacing. Higher density, covering a little bit more territory, but largely the same areas. Again, non-penetrating. This is on the brain surface, not going in the brain. And I just want to take 30 seconds here to acknowledge this incredible group of people that have been working night and day over the last 6 months to get this project to work. This includes Sean Metzger, Kayla Littlejohn, Alex Silva, Margaret Seaton, David Moses, Max Doherty, Jesse Leo, and my collaborator at Berkeley, Gopala. So this project started about 6 months ago, but given all that she was putting into, we also put in a lot of effort, including working over Thanksgiving and Christmas in order to get all of this to work. And just to put some context, expectedly, we got better results. We have more information. We had someone highly motivated. So just to put it into context, in terms of text decoding. For example, I showed you an example of spelling before using the NATO code words. These were the days after surgical implantation, so this is the 25th, so about a month or 25 days after the surgery. We started with some training sessions. We started recording with Anne. And over about 6 to 8 training sessions, she got to about 95 plus accuracy on decoding NATO code words. And that was pretty good sign for us. In fact, I remember seeing the earliest results is after one training session, she was already at 60+%. Okay, so chances like 2%. But just after one training session, she was already at 60, and the rest of the time, just 6 or 8 more days, we're up to about 95%. Now, we froze the classifier, the decoder, at about 10 days in, and then we just kept testing it every morning, and it was very stable. Again, no recalibration, just plug and play native decoding. And then Anne got to go home for a couple months. She came back, plugged her in, and continued to get good recordings. It was very important, stability. Okay, not changing around every day, different things, very different. So because we were very encouraged by that, we decided to do something more ambitious with this, okay? In addition, so we decided to build what we call a multimodal speech neuroprosthetic. And the basic idea here was that we weren't going to just have one output, we were going to try to decode 3 outputs. And I'm not going to describe the full extent of it, but at the end of it, we actually can do all of them simultaneously. But I will show you the parts individually. So one stream is decoding, using a neural network, phone probabilities, and those phone probabilities go in language model, and you see text on a screen. A parallel algorithm is running that is synthesizing speech from the brain activity and generates audible speech through a speaker. And the third one, which is the most novel output that we had not done before, was essentially to decode the movements of her vocal tract and her mouth, her lips, to control a digital avatar. So basically this is, you put the synthesis and the face together, that's what we call a talking face, a digital avatar. And there's a couple of reasons why we did this. The main reason was that we wanted to embody speech. Brain activity to text is really not the most natural way to communicate. We don't think in text, for example. We think in words, and we think of words coming out of our mouth. So we wanted to embody, we wanted to put the words literally back into the vocal tract. There's other reasons. We wanted to enhance feedback learning for her. So there's this idea that if you see a talking model, you can enhance that learning. The second one is to restore personhood and identity in a way that text can't do by itself, to make it more natural, and to facilitate virtual social interactions. So someday, the idea is that Anne will be able to communicate with other paralyzed people using a virtual avatar, okay, facilitate virtual interactions for someone who is otherwise fully paralyzed. This is the text decoding algorithm that Sean Metzger developed and turned out to be very effective. Again, leveraging years of experience with this. So here, this is what we call copy, text copy. So we give her a prompt at the top, and she's instructed to copy that. It's not doing it one word at a time. There's a countdown, and then she's instructed to start trying to attempt to speak that. And you can see it's much faster for full sentences. There's occasionally words that she gets wrong, but a lot of them are correct. Weird sentence, but somehow it got into our data set. So we were thrilled to see that. So with this particular configuration, with Anne, we're able to get up to about 78 words per minute with accuracy about 25% word error rate. This was trained with a 1,000 word vocabulary. Offline modeling basically looks identical word error rate up to 30,000 words. And the reason for that is that in English, the probability, it's very much influenced by the word frequency. So whether it's 1,000 or 30,000 words, because of that property of English, it doesn't actually change the word error rate using the language model that much. Because this is using a model that is looking at individual phones, individual speech segments. Now, here's the speech synthesis algorithm. And so this is one developed by Kalo and Gopala. And here we used a RNN to derive discrete speech units. And the way that we derive that is quite interesting and important. We use statistical modeling in order to derive essentially like computational units of speech. We don't call them phones or anything else. These are statistically derived. So if you take English and you ask the computer basically to derive the 100 most important units that you can put in combination to do synthesis, this is what it generates. And this is what we call concatenative approach as compared to a regression-based approach. It's decoding these intermediate steps that are segments, and then these are combined to create this Mel spectrum, and then that is decoded into words that you can hear. And to make it even a little bit more personalized, what Kalo did was he actually modeled it after Anne's original voice. So she had not been speaking for 18 years. But we got hold of a video from her wedding where she spoke actually for about an hour. It was pretty incredible. And what Kalo did was he modeled the voice from the video before she lost it, and then modeled that into the speech synthesis algorithm in order to make it sound more like her. So here's some of the results of that. So this is the decoded speech for a couple of sentences. This is the reference sentence. So this is not something that she ever said. This is just someone else speaking. And just to show you some sample waveforms, and you can see some of the broad things are fairly similar. Here's some of the quantification. So we looked at different data sets of 50 phrases, 500 phrases, 1,000 word, random kind of thing. And the model, of course, is sensitive to the vocabulary size. But not only was it intelligible, it was never trained on her own speech and works. So I'll give you an example of that. But it's going to be combined with the avatar. So the last thing that I talked about was this facial avatar. So same thing, using a recurrent network, decoding articulatory gestures, movements of the face, and taking the weights from that and moving a digital model of the face to create an animation. And this, we collaborated with this company called Speech Graphics. So it's basically taking this and putting it into their model. Actually, it does pretty well, so I'm not going to go into this for sake of time. But here's the demo. So she's instructed to say some stuff that she sees on the screen when it turns green. We're still making it go faster, so just keep in mind this is really one of the first versions of this. It's quite slow. But we think it's the first audio-visual synthesis avatar.
Rusty Baker. I am doing well today. Anything is possible.
So this is what we call audio-visual synthesis. So it's a combination of both the sound and the face. Now to embody speech itself for Anne. And because we built this avatar, we said, okay, what the heck, let's try something more gestures, moving the mouth, facial expressions. These are some of the classification results. It's pretty good. And just an example of that. Yeah, we're working on the latencies to pull this down, but that's coming very soon. Kind of like delayed reaction. Okay, so I just want to finish there with, some of the key things that have been along this journey. I think things are moving very quick. The field is incredible. There's a lot of interest in this. Something in particular to me that's been very satisfying was when we started this endeavor, and I was getting advice when I started my own lab, what do you want to do? Well, I want to see if we can do a speech BCI. One of my close friends said that makes no sense, that's impossible. But we are closely, we're getting close. Progress is being made, despite the complexity of speech. We've learned about the science, encoding of articulatory movements. We've learned about laryngeal motor cortex. We've learned about actual kinematic properties, like the position, velocity of the different articulators for consonants and vowels. We've made a lot of progress in the translation. So we're getting to this idea of high-performance text synthesis and facial avatar. And this concept called embodied speech neuroprosthesis that can enhance verbal and actually nonverbal communication. This has been fueled by increases in the bandwidth, the channel count, and optimization of AI methods. So future work for us is what we call optimization. We want to get the synthesis faster, more accurate. You can see there's pretty long latencies. We've got a lot of things we're working on to do that. We also, importantly, want to make sure this generalizes across populations. Is this going to work in people who are fully locked in with ALS or other kind of etiologies? We need to make continuum interface improvements for performance and more. So I'm going to just close with a quote from Anne. She says, after my stroke, I used a letterboard. My husband was so sick of having to get up and translate it for me. We didn't argue because he didn't give me a chance to argue back. As you can imagine, this frustrated me greatly. Being able to speak and hear my voice is emotional. It is huge. And her last request, please make this wireless. Here's the incredible Bravo team. Thanks, everyone.